On June 23, 2016, an entire country headed into the unknown. That's the day 17.4 million people in the United Kingdom voted to become the first country to leave the European Union. This is the story of Brexit. We begin 60 years ago. After World Wars I and II had brought unprecedented death and destruction to the continent, a simple theory gained traction. If countries form stronger economic ties, they'll be much less likely to fight each other. So, in 1957, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and West Germany signed the Treaty of Rome and formed the European Economic Community. The UK wasn't included. It tried to join in 1963 and 67, but was blocked by French President Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle didn't trust the British and their close allies, the United States, although de Gaulle's official reason was that the UK's economy wasn't compatible with Europe's. A few years later, once de Gaulle was out of power, the UK became a member of the EEC in 1973. But not everyone was sold on the idea, so just 2 years after joining, the UK held its first ever national referendum to decide whether it should turn around and leave. The vote wasn't close. 67% of the electorate chose to stay. In the years since, the EEC has become known as the European Union, expanded to 28 member states, and enacted countless laws and reforms that have created a thriving political and economic zone with 500 million citizens. In many ways, it was designed to mirror the world's most successful federal republic, the United States. Just like the American colonies had done 2 centuries earlier, the individual countries of Europe decided they'd be better off, economically, geopolitically, if they formed a unified group. It was a good decision. For proof, look no further than the year-by-year per-person GDP rate, which has skyrocketed across the entire Eurozone. Germany, the UK, and France, the EU's biggest economies and the 4th, 5th, and 6th largest individual economies in the world, have seen their growth track right along with each other since they became unified at roughly the rate of the United States. A look at the emerging economies of Brazil, China, and South Africa gives you a better sense of just how closely the Europeans have tracked together. Look at Turkey, who wants desperately to join the Union, compared to Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the 4 EU countries most affected by the global downturn at the end of the previous decade, and you see more evidence of the power of the EU in driving growth. As the EU became more and more integrated, as its members chose to give up more and more of their sovereignty, the UK kept negotiating ways to stay independent from key aspects of the rest of the Union. It didn't open its borders like the rest of the EU did in 1995 to create completely free movement within the Union, and it chose to keep the British pound as its currency instead of adopting the euro. But the development that made the UK's eventual exit most likely was the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. Not only did it make the EU's central institutions more efficient and more powerful, but, for the first time, it gave its members an official mechanism to leave, called Article 50. At around the same time, the world was hit by a severe recession. Greece, whose public debt was far higher than most other EU members, was worse off. Its fellow Union members forced it to implement severe spending cutbacks in exchange for the money it needed to stabilize its economy. The Great Recession was followed by a migrant crisis, as millions of refugees fled war-torn countries across the Middle East and North Africa. As immigration rates rose across Europe, the preferred destination was one of the big 3 economies, Germany, the UK, or France. With all these new arrivals, many of whom were in need of tremendous public assistance, anti-immigrant nationalist feelings rose. As Europe's leaders came under heavy pressure to stop the flow, fences and walls were built in the east, patrols were intensified along the Mediterranean coast, camps were set up along borders, and deportations rose. Some leaders, like Germany's Angela Merkel, pledged to welcome large numbers of migrants, while the UK, as an island, was able to stop the flow more easily. Facing a tough re-election, UK Prime Minister David Cameron promised that, if he won, he'd schedule a public referendum on whether the UK should leave the EU. When he did win, he used this as leverage to renegotiate a few minor terms of the UK's membership. Although it changed little, Cameron hailed it as a victory. It was the first time an existing EU member country had been permitted to have its own special deal.
Britain will be permanently out of ever closer union, never part of a European superstate. There will be tough new restrictions on access to our welfare system for EU migrants. No more something for nothing.
The deal was dependent on Britain choosing to remain in the Union during the referendum scheduled for June 2016. By campaigning hard for the Remain side, Cameron also made it a referendum of sorts on his time in office, while giving his rivals and critics who wanted him out an extra incentive to push for Brexit. Chief among those urging Brexit were right-wing politicians who relied on inflamed rhetoric and misinformation. One of the primary Leave arguments was that the UK, as one of the wealthier countries in the Union, was contributing too much money to the EU budget. Another factor that pushed Britain toward the exit was terrorism. A string of attacks, some carried out by immigrants, had hit Europe, including the devastating November 2015 violence in Paris that killed or injured nearly 500 people. A look at the data also helps us understand why immigration was a key issue. Compared to the 4 other European countries with more than 40 million residents, the UK has the highest population density. The US, if you're wondering, is 6 times less crowded than the UK. And as you can see in this graph, for the better part of 15 years, the UK has been absorbing far more immigrants than before, capped off by its 2 highest years of net migration right before the Brexit vote. Which finally brings us to the decision that shocked the world. By a narrow vote of 51.9 to 48.1, the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union. The consequences were immediate. Cameron resigned and the value of the British pound plummeted. Today, it remains around 15% lower against the dollar. Theresa May, a member of Cameron's cabinet, had been against Brexit, but in a cunning move, chose not to publicly campaign, positioning her perfectly to succeed Cameron as Prime Minister when Brexit passed. True to her Brexit means Brexit saying, May sent a letter to EU President Donald Tusk invoking Article 50, which starts a 2-year countdown for the UK to negotiate its future relationship with Europe before it has to leave.
A few minutes ago in Brussels, the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the EU handed a letter to the President of the European Council on my behalf, confirming the government's decision to invoke Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union.
2 years isn't a very long time to get through the long list of key points, which include whether the European Court of Justice will continue to have jurisdiction over the UK, whether the UK will reject the EU's Human Rights Act in favor of writing their own British Bill of Rights, how the security and crime fighting relationship will work, how much the UK will pay for EU projects and programs that it committed to before Brexit, what the rights are for EU citizens living in the UK and vice versa for Britons living in the EU. What will happen to Scotland, who voted to remain in the EU by a large number of 62 to 38%. There is some talk that it will leave the UK and become an EU member. What will happen along the land border between Northern Ireland of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, an EU member state? There is currently a common travel area between the UK and the Republic. The man who wrote Article 50, the distinguished diplomat Lord John Kerr, detailed the bill Britain must agree to pay before any negotiations can move forward.
The trade negotiation will not get very far until the money negotiation is clearly settling. Now, the money negotiation is going to be a very nasty negotiation.
But perhaps the biggest issue is whether Brexit will be hard or soft. This mainly has to do with trade and immigration. A soft Brexit would largely keep things the same as they are now, with the continued free movement of goods and people from the continent. But a hard Brexit would result in import taxes on goods and services in both directions. Hard would also restrict the migration of EU citizens into the UK. Norway is an example of how a soft Brexit would work. It is a member of the single market, but not a full EU member. So for access to the market, it accepts the free movement of people. When it comes to these negotiations, the most influential leader in the EU, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, has made it clear that Europe is going to drive a hard bargain and will look after the interests of its 27 members.
Ein Drittstaat, und das wird Großbritannien sein, kann und wird nicht über die gleichen Rechte verfügen oder womöglich sogar besser gestellt werden können als ein Mitglied der Europäischen Union.
The UK is in a terrible bargaining position and has put the EU leadership in a tough spot. Why would they allow the UK to leave but still keep the best parts of union membership? In order to maintain the legitimacy of the EU, it has to make an example out of the UK. It must show its members that leaving has very real consequences. This has many British business leaders like entrepreneur David Cleaveley nervous.
My concern about Brexit is that we have a big market just a few miles away and we're not going to be able to access it as freely as we could before.
Once a deal is hammered out, at least 20 of the 27 countries in the Union must approve it. But if no deal is reached, negotiations can only continue if all 27 EU countries agree to extend the talks. Regardless of whether there's a deal in place when the UK leaves, the moment it does, all the EU laws Britain has been living under cease to apply. To deal with this potential catastrophe, the UK plans to pass a Great Repeal Bill. It will copy all the existing EU laws into UK law to give Parliament time to decide which laws to keep, change, or get rid of. This uncertainty has many who voted for Brexit regretting their decision. As it's looking like independence won't be so great after all, opinion polls are consistently showing that the result would be reversed if the referendum were held again. So, is there any chance the UK could reverse course? We'll again turn to the author of Article 50. After running through various scenarios for how Brexit could play out, Lord Kerr said this.
There is, and I'm almost ashamed to mention it, the possibility of the United Kingdom changing its mind. And Article 50 notification, the triggering, is revocable.
So that's Brexit in a nutshell, but I want to know what you think. Is this a classic case of people not appreciating what they have and thinking the grass is greener on the other side? And what do you think will be the most significant effect of the UK's withdrawal? Thanks for watching. For The Daily Conversation, I'm Bryce Plank.